A cinematic reconstruction of the cataclysm, towering walls of water surging inland, splintering ships, and swallowing palaces. Known history frames tsunamis as sudden natural tragedies, but hidden accounts suggest warning signs were ignored or silenced. This opening sets the tone by pulling the audience directly into the kingdom's final moments. The camera drifts over a calm, glassy ocean just before dawn. Fishing boats bob gently, their crews casting nets with the same ease their fathers and grandfathers did before them. In the distance, gulls cry out, the sound sharp in the still air. The sun peaks over the horizon, but something about the light feels different, thicker, more oppressive. The tide seems lower than usual, revealing stretches of seabed normally hidden, with fish flopping helplessly on the sand. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the water withdraws further. Children chase the retreating tide, laughing as they collect shells, unaware that the ocean's strange behavior is not a gift but a warning. Merchants glance toward the sea, brows furrowed. A fisherman drops his net mid-throw, frozen by the eerie sight of the horizon bulging upward, as though the sea itself were rising to block out the sky. The first rumble is distant, like thunder beneath the earth. Dogs begin to bark and pull at their leashes. Horses rear and stamp nervously in the market square. The air grows heavy with the scent of salt and something else, metallic, sharp, electric. In the royal harbor, ships rock violently, though no wind stirs, and sailors shout over the groaning of their hulls. Then, without warning, it appears a wall of water taller than any building, advancing with relentless speed. It is not just a wave, it is the ocean itself, uprooted and charging toward the shore. It swallows the outer docks in a heartbeat, reducing stone piers to rubble. Whole ships vanish beneath it before they can break their moorings. The wave strikes the royal seawall, shattering it as though it were made of clay. The streets become rivers in seconds. People run, but the water is faster, sweeping through alleys and marketplaces with impossible force. Palaces that took generations to build crumble in moments, their gilded spires toppling into the flood. The roar of the wave drowns out screams, the crashing of stone, even the wind itself. In known history, such a tsunami would later be described as a sudden and unpredictable act of nature, a tragedy no one could have foreseen. But hidden accounts, buried in temple vaults and passed down through fragments of oral tradition, tell another story. They speak of strange celestial signs, of warnings given by priests and ignored by rulers more concerned with trade profits than the whispers of omens. They tell of fishermen who urged their families to flee inland, only to be mocked as superstitious. In this retelling, the day the ocean rose is not simply the story of nature's fury, it is the story of a kingdom that had a chance to prepare, perhaps even to survive, yet chose not to act. This is the lens through which we will explore the final hours of the coastal kingdom, a disaster born not only of shifting tectonic plates, but also of human pride, political miscalculation, and the deadly comfort of thinking tomorrow will be just like today. As the wave recedes, it leaves behind a wasteland, where there were once bustling streets. There is now only silence, broken by the crackle of fires and the distant cries of survivors searching for loved ones. The ocean retreats as if satisfied, pulling debris, bodies and treasures alike back into its depths. In its wake the kingdom lies broken, a place that will soon be spoken of not as a thriving empire, but as a cautionary tale. This opening scene is more than a spectacle of destruction, it is an invitation to descend into the depths of history, to search for what truly happened before the wave struck, and to uncover the truths long buried beneath the tides. A sweeping visual journey along the modern-day shoreline, where the kingdom once stood. Official geography textbooks mention nothing beyond vague ancient settlements, yet archaeological anomalies, stone roads disappearing into the sea, tell another story. This section contrasts the official erasure with the physical remnants still clinging to the coast. The camera glides low over the coastline at dawn, the light catching on waves as they crash against jagged black rocks. To the casual visitor, it is an unremarkable stretch of shore, salt marshes, dunes scattered with driftwood, and fishing huts clinging to the wind-beaten cliffs. But to those who know where to look, this is a palimpsest of history, the surface hiding older stories written in stone and silt. From above, faint straight lines cut through the coastal sand, stone paths just visible beneath the tide during low water. They extend far into the surf, vanishing under the rolling waves. Locals know these as the old roads, and in certain seasons, when storms strip away the top layer of sand, carved patterns emerge. Symbols too deliberate to be the product of nature. Official geography books, the kind studied in universities and printed with the authority of government seals, say little about these traces. At most, they are mentioned as possible remains of late medieval fishing structures or erosion patterns. Nothing in those pages hints at the scale or significance of what lies offshore. No talk of plazas now drowned, or of statues whose bases can still be felt under the feet of daring divers. Yet the evidence refuses to vanish. On stormy days, the sea coughs up fragments, worked stone blocks with right-angled edges, shards of pottery glazed in colors unknown to local craft traditions, and rusted bronze fittings encrusted with barnacles. Fishermen who trawl near certain spots sometimes find their nets snagging on something heavy and unyielding far below. Those who dive to investigate speak of dark silhouettes rising from the seabed, columns, archways, and carved figures staring out into the green gloom. One elderly villager, interviewed in the faded light of his wooden porch, tells the story of his grandfather's discovery, a massive slab of stone etched with what looked like the crest of a long-vanished royal house. The authorities took it away, he says, and we never saw it again. They told us it was nothing, just a rock. He chuckles without humor. Rocks don't have crowns carved into them. The coastline itself seems to conspire in keeping the kingdom's memory alive. Tides wear down the sand to reveal hints of paved courtyards, before swallowing them again in a matter of weeks. Cliffs crumble to expose walls made of cut stone, their mortar still holding after centuries, only to be buried once more by landslides. The sea takes, but sometimes it also returns. This forgotten shoreline tells a story very different from the one written in the official records. The sanctioned version erases complexity. It flattens centuries into a blank page, leaving room only for speculation and convenient myth. But the physical remnants, stubborn and undeniable, contradict that narrative. They whisper of a place where the land met the sea in grand design, not mere accident, where roads were built to connect harbors and harbors to cities, and cities to the farthest reaches of an empire, whose ships ruled the horizon. As the camera moves inland, we see more subtle traces, low mounds overgrown with scrub, their shapes too regular to be natural. Farmers plow up shards of glassy obsidian, unlike any found in local geology. Children playing near a tidal pool discover a small bronze figurine of a seabird. Its surface worn smooth but its craftsmanship unmistakable. These are not relics of scattered fishermen, they are the detritus of a people whose wealth and reach demanded artistry, order, and permanence. The contradictions are impossible to ignore. On one hand, the maps, textbooks, and official narratives treat this place as an unimportant backwater until modern fishing villages dotted its shores. On the other, the earth and sea themselves present hard evidence of a vanished sophistication, straight lines where there should be none, ornaments where only utility would be expected. The section closes with a slow descending shot beneath the waves, where sunlight filters down to reveal the ghostly outline of a road paved in massive slabs, each precisely cut. The road stretches into the murk, farther than the eye can follow, as though inviting us to journey deeper, not just into the sea, but into the history the world has chosen to forget. Recounting the rise of the coastal kingdom from fishing villages to a sprawling trade hub, Historians emphasize its prosperity from spice and pearl trade, but oral traditions hint at advanced navigation, maps predating known civilizations. The narrative blends grandeur with the unsettling realization that the kingdom was more advanced than recorded. The origins of the coastal kingdom were humble, clusters of reed huts perched along tidal flats, their people living by the rhythm of the sea. The first settlers were expert fishers, skilled in reading the currents, their boats carved from single tree trunks, their nets knotted by hand. Generations lived this way, their existence bound to the tides, the stars and the migrations of fish. But in these early communities, something else was forming, a talent for the sea that went beyond survival. It began with curiosity. Fishermen ventured farther from shore than necessity demanded, returning with stories of distant islands and strange goods they could not have produced themselves: gleaming shells, dyed fabrics, metal tools of foreign design. Over time, these exploratory journeys became deliberate voyages. They learned the winds, they marked the reefs, and they memorized the shifting patterns of the clouds. The people who had once feared storms now began to chase them, using the gales to reach new shores. Archaeologists, working from what little evidence survives on land, date the kingdom's formal rise to around the same era as other early coastal powers. They speak of the spice trade, of pearls harvested from the kingdom's warm shallows, of merchant ships returning heavy with gold, textiles, and rare stones. These details are well documented in neighboring states' trade records, which describe the kingdom's harbor as the markets where all winds meet. Yet oral traditions, stories passed down through generations of fishermen's families, hint at something more extraordinary. Elders speak of maps drawn long before the kingdom's rise to power, maps etched into copper plates and preserved in sealed chests. These were not crude sketches of coastlines, but precise representations of far-off lands, some thousands of miles away, including places that modern scholars claim were unknown at the time. In these tales, the first rulers were not simply merchants, they were navigators of unmatched skill, able to plot courses across open oceans without landmarks. They read the stars not merely for direction but for timing, knowing which celestial alignments would bring safe passage and which would herald storms. Some say they had devices, lost to history, that allowed them to measure the angle of the sun with perfect accuracy. The kingdom's transformation accelerated when inland trade routes faltered. Where other regions struggled, the coastal kingdom expanded, using the sea as its highway. Great timber ships replaced the small fishing boats, their hulls built to withstand months at sea. Sails of woven palm fiber caught the wind in broad curves, allowing for faster travel even against the prevailing gusts. Soon the kingdom's fleets were not only bringing goods home, but carrying its own exports: salt, preserved fish, fine ceramics across the horizon to distant markets. With trade came wealth, and with wealth came architecture. Harbors were expanded into stone-lined basins, warehouses rose along the shore, filled with spices, pearls, and bolts of silk from foreign lands. Palaces glittered with shell-inlaid walls, while temples stood as both places of worship and symbols of maritime dominance. The most sacred shrines faced the sea, as if acknowledging the kingdom's true source of power. Historians who rely on written records portray this as a familiar story. A modest fishing society grows rich through trade, becomes a regional power, and leaves its mark on history before disappearing. But the oral histories, the whispered legends, and the scattered archaeological finds suggest something more sophisticated. If the copper maps existed, they imply a level of cartographic knowledge far ahead of their time. If the navigational devices were real, they would have placed the coastal kingdom centuries ahead of its rivals in maritime technology. And yet, for all its accomplishments, the official narrative remains curiously restrained. Schoolbooks summarize the kingdom in a few short paragraphs, focusing on its role in the spice and pearl trade, before shifting quickly to its destruction. The idea that it could have been a cradle of advanced navigation, a place whose influence reached continents away, is barely mentioned, if at all. The contrast between the grandeur of its achievements and the silence of modern history is striking. How did a civilization that commanded such wealth, such skill, and such influence vanish so completely from the recognized record? The answers lie not just in its destruction by the sea, but in the centuries before, when the kingdom's mastery of navigation may have made it both indispensable to and envied by its neighbor. The section closes with a lingering shot of the sea at twilight, waves rolling in endless rhythm. Beneath that surface once sailed ships whose names are lost, whose routes traced lines across oceans now forgotten. Somewhere out there, perhaps still hidden under centuries of silt and salt, may rest the copper maps and navigation tools that could rewrite everything we think we know about the birth of maritime empire. Exploring the dual relationship between the kingdom and the ocean, public narratives romanticize the sea as their source of wealth, but temple carvings and recovered tablets speak of the drowning tide as an ancient curse. This section foreshadows the disaster by showing how their prosperity carried a shadow of fear. From the moment the coastal kingdom took shape, the sea was both its lifeblood and its greatest uncertainty. The official histories present the relationship as a romance, people and ocean in perfect harmony, the tides delivering wealth and abundance in return for skill and respect. In this telling, the kingdom's fleets were ambassadors of prosperity, their sails a symbol of unity with the waters they traversed. But beneath the poetry of the public narrative, a more complicated story was carved into stone and whispered in temples. Priests and scribes spoke of the drowning tide, a force as inevitable as the seasons, foretold to come not once but in cycles. According to inscriptions on weathered limestone panels, the sea was not a passive ally, it was a living force with moods capable of generosity and vengeance alike. The capital's largest temple, dedicated to the sea goddess Nora, bore a mural stretching from floor to ceiling. On one side, her hands overflowed with fish and pearls, pouring them into the open hands of the people. On the other, her gaze hardened, and she raised her arms to summon a black wall of water that swept away palaces and ships alike. In the modern, cleaned-up versions of this mural, shown in tourist brochures and museum replicas, the destructive half is often left out entirely. Recovered clay tablets from the kingdom's inland archive tell similar stories. One describes a year when the salt waters rose without warning, and the great ships cracked like shells upon the rocks. Another tablet, translated only in recent decades, warns that the sea takes back its gifts when the people grow deaf to her voice. While modern scholars file these as allegorical cautionary tales, the tone of the original writing feels less symbolic and more like recorded memory. The kingdom's everyday life was filled with this contradiction. Harbors bustled with traders haggling over exotic goods, while in the same breath dockworkers made small offerings of grain or coins to shrines before a voyage. Children were taught to swim almost before they could walk, yet they were also warned never to turn their backs on the sea. Festivals celebrated the bounty of the waves, but the most sacred rites took place in shadow, away from outsiders, invoking protection against something that everyone hoped would never come. To the people of the coastal kingdom, the ocean's dual nature was not abstract, it was lived reality. One season could bring ships home so heavy with cargo, they nearly split their seams. The next could see storms scatter entire fleets. The most experienced sailors spoke of a certain silence before a great storm, when the air itself felt heavy and the gulls fled inland. Some historians suggest that this constant awareness of the ocean's power shaped the kingdom's politics. Rulers maintained the sea walls not merely for defense against raiders, but as bulwarks against the water itself. Taxes were levied on maritime trade, specifically to fund coastal reinforcements, and special envoys were appointed to maintain the harmony between land and tide, a role that seems as much spiritual as administrative. And yet, prosperity often dulls caution. As trade expanded and wealth poured in, the warnings carved into stone and pressed into clay began to feel like relics of a more fearful time. New rulers favored the imagery of the ocean as a boundless provider, erasing depictions of its destructive side from public spaces. Even the murals in Nora's temple were partially repainted, softening the goddess's expression and muting the darker tones of the drowning scenes. This selective memory is what makes the drowning tide prophecies so haunting in hindsight. While public life celebrated the ocean's generosity, the kingdom's sacred archives and oldest carvings kept alive the knowledge that this same sea had the power to erase everything. It was not a matter of if, but when. The section closes with the image of the original temple mural in its untouched form, as revealed by underwater archaeologists centuries later. The goddess Nora, frozen in two halves, giver and taker, her eyes fixed not on the past but on the moment yet to come. Detailed look at the kingdom's grand palaces, harbors, and sea walls. Academic consensus portrays them as decorative marvels, yet engineering analysis suggests designs meant to withstand massive waves. The juxtaposition raises questions. Were they building for beauty or for survival against a threat they knew would come? The coastal kingdom was not merely a society of ships and traders. It was a realm of stone, mortar, and vision. From the moment a traveler's vessel approached its shores, the skyline proclaimed its power. White limestone palaces catching the sunlight, tiered towers rising like steps toward the heavens, and great harbors that could cradle fleets without crowding. To visiting merchants, these were works of aesthetic genius, proof of a people who had transformed their prosperity into monuments. Scholars who study the ruins today often echo that sentiment, describing the architecture as a celebration of maritime wealth or an ornamental expression of civic pride. But a closer look at the engineering tells another story. The sea walls, for instance, were unlike anything seen in neighboring regions. Rather than straight barriers, they curved inward toward the harbor, their bases flared wide beneath the waterline. Modern coastal engineers recognize this design as one that disperses the energy of incoming waves, reducing their destructive force, a technique not formally documented elsewhere until millennia later. Beneath these walls ran channels that could divert and slow floodwaters before they reached the inner city. Palaces, too, had hidden defenses. Their lower levels were built not of delicate carved stone but of massive interlocking blocks, each one weighing several tons. The ground floors often lacked windows, and where they did exist, they were narrow slits, suggesting an intentional resistance to both wind and water pressure. Some were anchored into bedrock with long, tapered stone roots, making them almost impossible to dislodge. The harbors were masterpieces of design. Breakwaters extended far into the sea, built of layered stone blocks filled with a mysterious cement-like substance that hardened underwater. Even today, divers report sections of these breakwaters still standing, defying centuries of storms and shifting tides. The docks themselves were constructed on raised platforms, accessible by sloping ramps that could be blocked or reinforced during rough weather. The most intriguing structures were the inland channels and reservoirs. At first glance, they appeared to be part of an elaborate irrigation system for the surrounding farmland, but analysis of sediment layers shows that these channels could also carry seawater away from the city during floods. Some were connected directly to the base of the seawalls, forming an integrated defense network. These design choices raise a critical question. Why would a kingdom so prosperous invest such immense resources into defenses against the sea if they saw the sea only as a friend? Were these measures a practical precaution born of centuries of storm experience, or a deliberate attempt to guard against a catastrophic event they feared might return? Archaeologists point to inscriptions found on cornerstones and foundation plaques, many of which invoke blessings for endurance through the water. One particularly well-preserved tablet, recovered from the foundation of a collapsed watchtower, bears the inscription, "We build for the day the sea stands against us." While official interpretations label this as poetic metaphor, the wording feels eerily literal, yet over time, the defensive elements were hidden beneath grandeur. Decorative colonnades were added to the tops of seawalls, their elegance disguising the sheer mass beneath. Palace facades were inlaid with shell and precious metals, diverting attention from the fortress-like bases. Public plazas were built atop flood-control channels, turning utilitarian features into places of leisure. This blending of beauty and survival is part of what makes the coastal kingdom so enigmatic. To an outsider, it looked like a city designed for display, a jewel of the sea. But to the people who built it, perhaps every elegant curve and graceful arch was also a shield, a promise to stand against the ocean's worst. One modern engineer, after studying underwater scans of the surviving harbor structures, remarked they were centuries ahead of their time. You don't build like this unless you know the sea can turn against you, and you expect it will. The section ends with a slow pan across a submerged breakwater, encrusted with coral and teeming with fish. The stones remain locked in place, the curves still visible, as if the builder's intent to last forever has been partially fulfilled, even beneath the waves that finally claimed their city. Modern underwater archaeology missions reveal stone pillars, plazas, and statues resting on the seabed. Official reports call them possible ship ballast, while divers' footage clearly shows symmetrical city layouts. The section emphasizes the gulf between cautious academic language and the undeniable visuals of a submerged metropolis. The first time a diver descended into the waters just beyond the old fishing harbor, he thought he'd found nothing more than scattered rock formations. Then, as the sunlight angled through the surface and lit the seabed, he saw the straight lines where no natural formation should exist. A row of pillars emerged from the gloom, each standing at the same distance from the next, their bases sunk deep into silt. Barnacles and coral clung to them like ivy, but the shapes were unmistakable, cylindrical shafts, carved capitals still faintly visible under centuries of marine growth. The diver's camera panned left to reveal an open expanse, a flat stone surface stretching beyond visibility, the plaza. It was here that the scale became clear. The plaza was not an isolated patch of flat stone, but the centerpiece of a deliberate design. Wide pathways radiated outward, flanked by low walls that might once have been shops, dwellings, or administrative buildings. The symmetry was too precise, the orientation too deliberate to be anything but human-made. Yet when these images were first presented to official review boards, the terminology was careful, almost evasive. The pillars were described as possible maritime ballast stones, the plaza as a natural seabed anomaly. The reason given, without indisputable proof: artifacts in situ, inscriptions, datable organic material. The structures could not be declared a city. Divers who had been there in person bristled at such caution. They knew the feel of stone blocks beneath their hands, the crisp right angles beneath the encrusting coral. They had swum through what could only be the archway of a building, the carved grooves in its lintel still distinct despite centuries underwater. Ship ballast doesn't line up in perfect squares, one veteran diver said into the camera, his frustration barely concealed. The gulf between official caution and the raw clarity of the visuals became even more stark when drone submersibles began mapping the site. The 3D scans revealed a grid, a city layout with streets running parallel and perpendicular, intersecting at consistent intervals. A harbor basin was visible on one edge of the map, its stone quay still largely intact. Farther inland, or what had once been inland, were larger rectangular foundations, their dimensions matching the palace complexes described in surviving chronicles. Scattered among the structures were statues. Most lay toppled, their faces half buried in the sand, but one stood upright in a sheltered corner of the plaza, its features softened by algae yet still hauntingly human. It depicted a robed figure holding a spiral shell to its ear, as if listening to the ocean. The artistry was refined, the proportions exact, the official report called it a carved object of indeterminate origin. This language, technically accurate, yet deliberately ambiguous, only fueled the divide between the academic establishment and the growing number of independent researchers convinced they were looking at the remains of the coastal kingdom. For the latter, the evidence was visceral, the sound of their own bubbles echoing against stone columns, the tactile confirmation of chisel marks beneath their gloves, the disorienting feeling of swimming through streets that once bustled with life. Adding to the intrigue were the smaller details. Along one section of wall, just above the sediment, divers uncovered what appeared to be a series of shallow carvings, spirals, wave-like patterns, and a symbol resembling an open eye. In another location, a toppled column revealed an inscription on its underside, preserved because it had been buried in sand almost immediately after the collapse. The script was unfamiliar, its curves and loops unlike the alphabets of known neighboring cultures. Still, without a direct link, an inscribed royal seal, a dated artifact, the academic bodies refused to make the leap from anomalous formation to lost city. Funding for further exploration was limited, and permits to dive in certain areas were tightened, officially to protect fragile marine environments. The footage, however, told its own story. Shared quietly among researchers, eventually leaking to the public, it showed divers swimming through archways, pausing in open courtyards, tracing their fingers along patterns worn into stone floors. Schools of fish darted through the shadows of once proud colonnades. Shafts of sunlight pierced the water above, illuminating a cityscape frozen in time. These echoes beneath the waves are not just relics, they are testimony. They speak of planning, artistry, and engineering. They whisper of a place that once stood on dry land, its people confident enough to build in stone, to shape the sea to their advantage, and to leave behind works meant to last centuries. And yet, here it lies, muted and shrouded in water, subject to the slow erasure of the tides. The section closes with a diver switching off his torch, letting the ambient light wash over the scene. For a moment, with the bubbles gone and the water still, the submerged city seems to hold its breath, waiting for someone to finally call it by its true name. Ancient folklore tells of strange colors in the sky, eerie silences before the waves, and animals fleeing inland. This section explores the intersection of myth and modern science, examining whether these accounts were descriptions of natural warning signs, ignored until it was too late. Before the ocean roared, before walls of water tore the city apart, the people looked up. The stories agree on this much. In the days before the Great Wave, the sky changed. Fishermen spoke of a light that shimmered unnaturally at the horizon, a coppery hue that lingered long after the sun had set. Children whispered about streaks of green and violet threading the clouds, colors normally reserved for the far north. These stories were passed down through oral traditions, embroidered with time, but the core details remained stubbornly consistent. In one version, an old temple record describes a curtain of fire drawn across the heavens. In another, a poem recovered from a neighboring kingdom speaks of a second dawn that came at night, where the sea glowed without the moon's permission. Modern scientists, examining these descriptions centuries later, recognize possible signs of atmospheric disturbances, phenomena that can accompany seismic activity or even volcanic eruptions under the sea. High levels of dust, ash, or ionized particles can scatter light in strange ways, painting the skies in colors that unnerve even the most seasoned sailor. But the sky's warning was not only visual, the accounts also speak of sound, or the lack of it. Fishermen setting out in the early morning reported an ocean as flat as glass, not a ripple disturbing the surface. Birds that usually wheeled overhead in noisy flocks were absent. Dogs and goats tethered near the shoreline became restless, pulling at their restraints, bleeding toward the inland hills. At first, the people didn't know what to make of it. Some saw it as a blessing. A calm sea meant easy fishing. Others, guided by old superstition, took it as a sign from the gods and postponed their journeys. A few, more sensitive to the uncanny, felt a knot of dread and kept their children close. This contrast, between those who saw opportunity and those who sensed danger, may have been the difference between life and death. In one surviving coastal ballad, a woman tells of her grandmother's warning, "When the birds flee the shore, the sea will soon follow." According to the song, the grandmother's family climbed the hills and watched from a distance as the great wave devoured the city below. Modern geologists point out that certain patterns do match real-world precursors to tsunamis. Unusual sky colors could have been auroras triggered by magnetic disturbances from undersea seismic shifts. The eerie silence might have been caused by a sudden drop in wind due to atmospheric pressure changes, and the fleeing of animals is now well documented in earthquake-prone regions, likely due to their ability to sense low-frequency vibrations before humans can. Yet in the official chronicles of the coastal kingdom, there is no record of such warnings, only the catastrophic event itself. Some suggest that any such signs, if noted, were dismissed as coincidences or folded into religious symbolism that prevented them from being understood as physical danger. The priests, perhaps seeing the sky's colors as a divine omen, might have led ceremonies instead of evacuations. The silence before the disaster is perhaps the most haunting detail. Survivors describe it as a pause in the world, where the wind ceased, the insects stilled, and the sea seemed to hold its breath. For a few moments, there was peace, a stillness so profound that it became unsettling. Then came the deep rolling sound, not like thunder but like a drum struck from the ocean floor. By the time the first wave appeared on the horizon, its crest gleaming in the strange copper light, it was already too late. Archaeological evidence offers faint support for these accounts. In some of the inland ruins, built hastily and lacking the ornate detail of the main city, researchers have found signs of temporary habitation, cooking fires, crude water storage pits, and scattered household objects. These may have been the shelters of those who fled early, whether by instinct or by heeding the sky's warning. What remains tantalizing is the possibility that the kingdom possessed a cultural memory of such events from even earlier times. A handful of symbols carved into the submerged city's temple stones match those found on artifacts in highland settlements far to the north, places untouched by the tsunami. Scholars debate whether these shared symbols represent trade, migration, or a system of warnings passed between generations. The section closes with a powerful visual, a panoramic view of the modern coastline at sunset, the sky briefly flaring with improbable color. The narrator poses the question, if we saw these signs today, if the air stilled, the birds fled, and the sea turned to glass, would we recognize them for what they are? Or would we, like the coastal kingdom, stand in awe of beauty that masked the approach of destruction? Centuries had passed since the Great Wave. The inland survivors' descendants no longer lived in fear of the ocean, but the coastline remained a place of superstition, a realm whispered about in fireside tales as cursed and unfit for human dwelling. Yet hunger for resources, curiosity, and the quiet pull of ancestral memory drew some back toward the water's edge. This section follows those first tentative expeditions where myth and reality collided, and the ruins of a lost kingdom emerged from the tide. By the time of these returns, the inland refugee communities had long transformed into stable agrarian societies. They had cleared new fields, developed trade routes through the highlands, and even built modest towns. But their soil was thin, their rivers narrow, and their winters harsher than the coasts had ever been. Wood, fish, and fertile farmland, once abundant, were now scarce commodities. The sea, for all its remembered terror, promised renewal. The earliest recorded return was not an organized mission, but a venture by a small group of young hunters who followed a river downstream until it widened into a brackish estuary. They expected empty shores and wilderness. Instead, at low tide they saw lines of cut stone, stretching out beneath shallow water, too precise to be natural. Even covered in seaweed and barnacles, these walls bore the unmistakable geometry of human construction. Word spread quickly. Within a year, the first proper expedition was launched, a mix of farmers seeking new land, traders curious about salvageable goods, and spiritual leaders hoping to reclaim sacred sites. They traveled with carts, oxen, and even small riverboats, arriving at the tidal flats during the season when the water was calmest. The return was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. What had been a bustling kingdom's capital was now a skeleton of its former self, the ocean having chewed away at the streets and swallowed whole districts. Roofless buildings leaned at odd angles, stone causeways vanished into the surf, seashells clung to the walls of what might once have been a palace courtyard. Every step closer to the shore was accompanied by the groan of waves against eroded foundations. Those who had grown up hearing only legend were struck by the eerie familiarity of the place. Some recognized patterns in the streets that matched descriptions passed down for generations, where the fish market had been, where the temple steps had risen. The elders who came along wept quietly, tracing their fingers over stones carved by their ancestors' hands. Archaeological evidence today confirms what these first returners saw. Core samples taken from the site reveal a layer of sand and marine debris above the original city foundations, a signature of the tsunami, followed by centuries of slow silt accumulation. Yet even after so long underwater, many walls and streets were remarkably intact, preserved by the sediment that had buried them. Salvaging from the ruins was difficult and dangerous. The tides were unpredictable, and much of the city lay beneath waist-deep water even at the lowest ebb. Wooden beams crumbled to the touch, having been softened by centuries of immersion. Metal tools rusted into shapeless lumps. Still, some treasures emerged, ceramic jars sealed with pitch and still containing grain, carved stone altars, and fragments of bronze jewelry encrusted with coral. But for every artifact recovered, there were countless moments of unease. The returning settlers reported strange sounds, like the echo of voices carried over the water, and the sudden collapse of weakened structures without warning. One survivor claimed to have seen a human skeleton sitting upright against a wall, as though frozen mid-flight from the wave, its skull still crowned with a circlet of beaten gold. The spiritual leaders interpreted these sights as signs. Some insisted the ancestors welcomed their children home. Others warned that the dead were restless, and that disturbing the ruins would bring misfortune. This split in belief would shape how the coast was approached in the centuries to come. Practically speaking, rebuilding on the drowned site was impossible. The tides claimed it twice a day, and storms could erase weeks of labor overnight. The settlers instead established their base on slightly higher ground, a few kilometers inland, where the soil was richer and the danger of flooding minimal. From there, they ventured to the ruins seasonally, salvaging stone blocks and transporting them upriver to construct temples and civic buildings in their new settlement. Over time, these seasonal visits became formalized into a ritualized event. Once a year, during the lowest tides of the lunar cycle, processions would make their way to the drowned city. They would bring offerings of food and incense, placing them on the steps of the submerged temple before retrieving whatever materials the ocean had spared. The ritual blended practicality and piety, ensuring that the memory of the coast was preserved without tempting fate by settling too close. The cultural impact of this return cannot be overstated. Myths of divine punishment began to soften, replaced by narratives of endurance and reclamation. The drowned kingdom was no longer just a cautionary tale, it was a lost heritage worth honoring, and perhaps one day fully recovering. Artists painted the ruins in vibrant colors, imagining them as they once were. Storytellers wove tales of hidden chambers beneath the waves, filled with treasures untouched by time. In the modern era, divers and marine archaeologists have confirmed many of these legends. Sonar scans reveal entire neighborhoods preserved beneath a blanket of silt, their streets still aligned toward the horizon, where the sun once rose over dry land. The same stone patterns noted by those first returners are still visible today, proof that their accounts were not mere romantic exaggerations, but eyewitness testimony to a civilization suspended between land and sea. The section closes with a poignant reflection. The first return to the drowned coast was not the end of the exile, but the beginning of a new relationship between people and the ocean. The fear never vanished, but neither did the longing. Each tide was a reminder, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, that the sea could give as much as it had taken. The first return to the coast had been hesitant, more ritual than conquest. But as generations passed, curiosity hardened into ambition. The inland settlements, now wealthier and better organized, began to see the drowned city not just as a place of ancestral memory, but as a resource to be charted, measured, and perhaps even reclaimed. This section explores the birth of organized maritime expeditions, the tools they devised to map a city lying beneath shifting tides, and the unexpected discoveries that changed the historical narrative forever. By the time of these early mapping efforts, the society had developed small but seaworthy craft, fishing had resumed on a limited scale, and the old fear of the deep had dulled with familiarity. These vessels, powered by oars and outfitted with high bows to cut through waves, allowed explorers to linger over submerged streets and temples during calm weather. No longer content with chance discoveries during low tide, leaders wanted a comprehensive understanding of what lay beneath the water. The first maps were crude sketches, scratched into clay tablets or painted onto stretched hides. They were less cartography and more memory aids. Outlines of visible structures drawn from observation when the sea retreated far enough. These early attempts showed only the upper levels of the drowned kingdom, the buildings that stubbornly broke the surface when the moon and tides aligned. Yet even these primitive charts revealed the city's staggering scale. The ruins extended far beyond the shallows, disappearing into depths too dangerous for the fragile boats of the time. To push further, explorers developed new techniques. Weighted ropes marked with knots allowed them to measure depth, and hooked poles were used to probe for submerged walls. Some tied stones to their waists and dove into the shallows to feel the shapes of hidden structures with their hands, surfacing breathless to describe what they had touched. In this way, piece by piece, the outlines of entire districts emerged: marketplaces, colonnaded avenues, and defensive seawalls that now lay useless under meters of water. One such expedition uncovered something that would challenge everything the survivors believed: the foundations of a harbor far larger than anyone imagined. Its stone piers extended hundreds of meters into what had been the bay, with mooring rings still embedded in the rock. The inland tradition had always described the drowned kingdom as a fishing village elevated to prominence, but the scale of this harbor hinted at something far greater: a hub of international trade, perhaps even a maritime empire. The expeditions also began to identify what they called ghost structural buildings that appeared intact beneath the waves during certain light conditions, their outlines visible from the surface like pale bones beneath skin. These moments became legendary among the mapping crews. On still mornings, when the water turned glassy, entire streets seemed to reappear in their original order, lined with columns and roofless halls. Then a shift in the wind or a passing swell would erase them, as though the city had decided it had shown enough for the day. Not all findings were welcome. Divers reported fissures in the seabed from which bubbles rose steadily, even in calm seas. Some feared these were vents that could herald another catastrophic event. Others dismissed them as natural phenomena. Whatever their cause, they reinforced the uneasy sense that the ocean floor was still alive, still capable of shifting without warning. The cultural implications of these maps were profound. As they became more accurate, they revealed that the city's layout was not random. It followed astronomical alignments. The main boulevard pointed directly toward the midwinter sunrise, while several temples lined up with specific star clusters. This detail, invisible to those who had fled inland centuries before, suggested a level of scientific and architectural sophistication far beyond the image of a doomed fishing town. What had been a sacred ruin now became a puzzle. Scholars debated whether the people who built it had anticipated the sea's advance. Some argued the alignments were an attempt to anchor the city to the heavens, a way of claiming permanence in a world of change. Others saw them as warnings, celestial markers that might have foretold the very disaster that destroyed the kingdom. The expeditions also reshaped political thinking. Control of the mapping crews meant control of knowledge, and in a society still rebuilding its hierarchy, knowledge was power. Rulers began to sponsor their own voyages, hoping to claim parts of the coast as extensions of their domain. Disputes broke out over who had rights to the submerged land, leading to the first written treaties that attempted to define ownership of something the ocean still ruled. In the modern era, marine archaeology has validated much of what these early mappers saw. Advanced sonar scans have confirmed the existence of the colossal harbor, complete with underwater storage chambers and ship repair docks. The alignments noted by the ancient expeditions have been measured with precision, matching the positions of stars as they appeared thousands of years ago. Even the so-called ghost structures have been explained, optical effects caused by sunlight refracting through layers of water at just the right angle. But the romance of those first maps remains. Their ink and clay may be faded or broken, but they represent humanity's refusal to let an entire city vanish without a trace. They are the record of a people who, instead of turning away from their loss, chose to face it with measuring ropes and hand-drawn charts, determined to wrest order from the chaos the sea had left behind. The section closes with a visual, a final scene of a mapping crew at dawn, their boat drifting over still water. Beneath them, the pale outlines of a colonnade shimmer into view. A scribe sketches feverishly before the tide returns, erasing the vision for another year. Above them, the same stars that once guided the kingdom's architects are fading into daylight, a silent reminder that the past is never entirely gone, only hidden. If mapping the sunken kingdom was an act of curiosity, salvaging it was an act of defiance. The sea had taken everything: homes, temples, markets, even the bones of the dead, but the people who had once fled inland began to dream of pulling pieces of it back. At first, this salvage was personal, a family reclaiming an heirloom, a fisherman retrieving a carved stone to serve as an anchor, but over time it grew into something larger, a coordinated effort to reclaim not just objects, but identity. These were not modern salvage operations with cranes and pressurized suits. The earliest attempts relied on courage, rope, and ingenuity. Divers tied heavy stones to their waists to sink quickly, feeling their way through the ruins in near darkness. They stuffed artifacts into woven baskets that were hauled up by crews above. Breath was the ultimate currency. Each diver's limit defined how far they could go and what they could bring back. The risks were constant: entanglement in collapsed beams, sudden changes in current, or simply misjudging the time needed to resurface. The first recovered treasures were humble but powerful in meaning: fragments of pottery painted with spirals, pieces of bronze tools, carved wooden figures preserved in silt. These objects were paraded through inland settlements, proof that the drowned kingdom was not a legend, but a place that could still give up its secrets. For many, holding such an artifact was like shaking hands with an ancestor. But soon, ambition outgrew sentiment. Salvagers began targeting architectural elements, columns, lintels, and statues. Moving such weight from the seabed to shore was a feat of raw determination. Teams lashed inflated animal skins to stone blocks, creating makeshift buoyancy aids. By timing their lifts with the tides, they could float the massive pieces toward the shallows, where dozens of hands and wooden rollers dragged them onto the beach. Some expeditions took weeks, with salvagers camping on the coast, waiting for the right conditions. Inevitably, politics followed. Rulers saw the prestige in displaying a marble statue or temple doorway from the old city in their new inland capitals. Possessing such relics became a mark of legitimacy, a declaration that one's authority was rooted in the grandeur of the past. As the salvage efforts grew, so did competition. Crews were hired not just for skill but for loyalty, and some expeditions clashed violently when they encountered rival teams at the same site. The ocean floor became contested territory. Not all objects were taken for pride or beauty. Some were believed to carry protective power, especially those recovered from temples. One legend spoke of a great basalt idol lifted at enormous cost from the submerged sanctuary of the sea god. Once placed in the inland capital, it was said to calm the river floods for a generation. Whether miracle or coincidence, the story ensured that temple salvage became a near-sacred duty. The risks, however, could not be ignored. Several accounts tell of salvage divers who never returned, sucked into fissures, trapped beneath falling masonry, or claimed by sudden storms. Superstitions flourished. Some believed the drowned kingdom itself resisted these efforts, that every object taken without proper ceremony angered the spirits of the dead. Rituals began to accompany major recoveries, offerings of food cast into the sea, songs sung at dawn to ask permission from the ocean. Over the centuries, the inland cities began to change under the influence of these salvaged pieces. Gates were rebuilt using stone blocks hauled from the seabed. Market squares displayed carved fountains that had once served the drowned city's central plaza. Even in architecture, echoes of the old kingdom returned. Arches, column styles, and decorative motifs copied from recovered fragments. The inland capitals became hybrid spaces, half new and half resurrected from the depths. Yet the deeper they salvaged, the more puzzling the finds became. Massive stone wheels with no apparent function, intricately carved slabs depicting astronomical charts, and tools made from materials not native to the region. These suggested a far more complex and connected civilization than the inland oral histories had described. Some scholars argued that the kingdom's technology may have rivaled, or even surpassed, that of later cultures. Modern archaeology has confirmed that some salvaged objects were indeed anomalous. Metallurgical analysis has revealed alloys that should not have been possible with the known techniques of the time. The astronomical carvings align with star positions thousands of years old, predating the kingdom's supposed founding. Such evidence has led to theories that the drowned city was part of a broader network of coastal cultures, now mostly erased by rising seas. The climax of this section comes with the retrieval of what is now called the harbor gate, two colossal stone uprights, and a lintel weighing many tons that once marked the entrance to the kingdom's main port. Ancient accounts describe the operation as a festival in itself, with hundreds of people hauling on ropes, chanting in rhythm as the tide bore the stones toward the beach. When they finally stood upright in the inland capital, they became not just a monument but a threshold, symbolically bringing the sea into the heart of the land. In the end, salvage was more than the recovery of stone and bronze. It was an act of cultural reclamation, a way to assert that the past could not be entirely erased. Each object, whether humble shard or towering gate, was a defiance against the ocean's appetite. And though the sea still covered most of the kingdom, the people could now walk among its fragments, touch them, and remember. The section closes on a visual, a diver surfacing at dusk, clutching a barnacle-encrusted statue. Behind him, the setting sun turns the water blood red, and in the distance the half-reconstructed gate of the inland capital catches the light. One world resurrected from the ruins of another. Once the first relics emerged from the depths, their meanings began to shift. What had started as objects of memory, and heritage soon became vessels for myth. The inland survivors, separated from their coastal origins by generations, needed stories to explain why their ancestors had built so close to the water and why the ocean had turned against them. In this vacuum, the figure of the sea god rose to prominence, reshaping history into a narrative of divine will, wrath, and appeasement. Known in some oral traditions as Aremo, in others as the one who waits beneath, this deity was imagined as both giver and taker. In older fragmented accounts, the sea had been a friend, a provider of food, trade, and connection, but in the new myths, Aremo became the executioner of a forgotten crime. The tsunami was no longer seen as an accident of nature. It was a sentence carried out by a god whose patience had run out. Relics pulled from the seabed took on new layers of meaning. A bronze spearhead was not merely a weapon, but a sacred gift wrestled back from the god's domain. A carved stone of spirals was not a decorative motif, but the sea god's own mark, a warning to all who saw it. The larger and stranger the artifact, the more potent the legend that clung to it. Some inland rulers claimed their salvaged treasures were appeasements, ransom paid to keep the waters from rising again. Others saw them as trophies, proof that humankind could challenge even divine power and win. One story tells of the basalt idol recovered from a temple submerged at the heart of the drowned city. According to legend, the divers who brought it up were blessed with supernatural stamina, able to hold their breath longer than any before them. But within months of the idol's placement in the inland city square, a series of unseasonal storms struck the coast. Priests declared this a sign that the idol was meant to remain underwater, and a great debate raged over whether to return it to the sea. The account ends ambiguously. Some versions claim it was resubmerged, others that it still sits in a hidden shrine, guarded from all but the most devout. The myths were not confined to religion alone, they bled into the political sphere. Rulers used the sea god as both threat and blessing, warning their subjects that only loyalty and obedience could keep the tides at bay. Major victories in battle were credited to divine favor, especially if the king or queen was seen carrying a relic from the drowned city. Coronations often included rituals of offering back small sacrifices of gold or grain cast into river, symbolically returning wealth to the water. Over generations, the legends became so deeply entwined with identity that they were no longer seen as myth, but as truth. The inland people called themselves children of the rescued shore, even though few had ever seen the ocean. Their festivals honored both the memory of the city and the god who had destroyed it. Songs told of a time when the sea god and humankind had been allies, and plays dramatized the moment when trust was broken, often portraying it as the fault of human arrogance. Archaeology complicates this picture. Many of the supposed sacred relics show clear signs of being everyday objects, cooking pots, decorative tiles, even structural beams, but myth has a way of rewriting reality. A pot found in the ruins might be recast as the vessel of first rains, believed to bring good harvests if filled at the start of planting season. A cracked column could become the pillar of the first dawn, said to hold the memory of the day the world began. The power of these legends was not just in their telling but in their performance. Priests would take salvaged items on processions, walking them through streets while chanting hymns. Children would be anointed with water that had been poured over these relics. Markets would erupt with amulets, small replicas of the sea god's supposed visage, sold to travelers as charms against drowning. Over time, these practices created an unbroken thread between the inland settlements and their sunken predecessor. But in every myth there is a shadow, an unspoken tension between reverence and fear. If the sea god could be appeased, then perhaps he could also be provoked. Whispered tales told of those who dared to mock him, claiming the inland cities were safe from his reach, only to see their crops ruined by flood or their children fall ill. Others told of divers who descended in greed, seeking treasure, and returned raving, convinced they had seen the gods' eyes staring at them from the dark. Even today, remnants of these beliefs survive in the fishing villages that cling to the modern coastline near the drowned city's suspected location. Fishermen refuse to set sail without making a small offering to the water. Children are warned never to turn their backs on the waves, lest the gods see you and remember. The legends of the sea gods serve a double purpose. They preserve fragments of real history while also obscuring it. They keep alive the memory of a coastal kingdom swallowed by disaster, but they also transform it into a morality tale, where the lesson is not about tectonics or tidal waves, but about the consequences of forgetting one's place in the order of the world. In the cinematic framing of this documentary, this section ends with an image both haunting and beautiful: a salvaged stone idol, its surface encrusted with coral, standing alone in a museum. Visitors pass by, unaware that for centuries people once knelt before it in fear and hope, convinced it was the very face of the ocean's god. Long before the tsunami drew its final curtain over the coastal kingdom, its influence stretched far beyond its shores. The people of this lost realm were not isolated, dreamers staring at the horizon. They were sailors, merchants, and navigators who carved watery highways between distant lands. The sea was not a barrier but a vast marketplace, and their ships were the threads that wove a shimmering tapestry of exchange. Archaeological finds, ceramic shards of unfamiliar clay, obsidian blades from volcanic islands hundreds of miles away, beads of carnelian that could only have come from far inland, suggest that this kingdom's reach was astonishing. In a world where most communities rarely saw beyond the next valley, these coastal people were conversing with cultures across the waves. The official history of nearby kingdoms remembers them vaguely, if at all, portraying them as peripheral or transient. But the material evidence tells a very different story. This was a hub, a crossroads where languages mingled, goods changed hands, and ideas traveled faster than storms. From the river deltas of the mainland, their ships carried grain and textiles. From island chains over the horizon, they brought back exotic hardwoods, shimmering shells, and precious dyes that colored the robes of their elites. Tin, a rare and valuable metal, flowed into the kingdom from distant mountain tribes, allowing them to forge bronze tools and weapons that outmatched their neighbors. In return, they exported finely worked gold jewelry, carved stone idols, and pottery, whose designs were so distinctive that fragments of it have been found thousands of miles away. But trade was more than goods. It was culture. Seafaring merchants returned not only with cargo but with stories, songs, and rituals. The coastal kingdom became a living archive of human connection. A temple bell from the north rang beside a market where spices from the south perfumed the air. Festivals once unique to far-off islands were celebrated in its harbors. Languages blended. Traders developed a Creole tongue of commerce that allowed them to haggle with anyone who set foot on their docks. The known history, recorded centuries later by inland scribes, diminishes this cosmopolitan reality. Their chronicles focus on inland capitals, battles, and dynasties, describing the coast as a frontier of fishers and pearl divers, with no mention of its central role in the economy of the region. To them, the drowned kingdom was merely a footnote, but the evidence lying silent beneath the waves paints the opposite picture. Without this maritime network, many inland centers might never have risen to prominence. The kingdom's harbors themselves were marvels of engineering. Stone quays reached into the water, shaped to deflect waves and shelter ships during storms. Channels were dredged to allow large vessels to dock directly at the market gates. Some underwater surveys suggest that breakwaters, massive for their time, curved like arms into the bay, embracing the fleet and ensuring safe passage even during rough weather. It was this infrastructure, as much as their courage on the open sea, that allowed trade to thrive. What's remarkable is how much the people of this realm trusted the sea. The inland cultures saw it as dangerous, unpredictable, a place for fishing perhaps, but not for building one's fortune. The coastal kingdom embraced the opposite philosophy. The ocean was a partner, a stage on which they could project their influence. This attitude infused their art, where ships were not depicted as mere transport, but as symbols of power and divine favor. In carvings, their vessels soar over stylized waves, crewed by figures in ceremonial headdresses, suggesting that trade voyages were as much sacred duty as economic venture. Hidden truths emerge when we consider the aftermath of the tsunami. The destruction of the kingdom would not only have been a human tragedy, it would have severed countless trade routes in a single day. Inland cities suddenly found their supply chains broken, their access to foreign luxuries cut off. Some may have taken this as a chance to seize control of trade themselves, rewriting the story to erase the memory of their former coastal partner. In doing so, they buried not just the physical city, but its role as the beating heart of the region's commerce. Evidence of these networks survives in unexpected places. A bronze mirror in an inland palace bears a motif common in the drowned kingdom's pottery, waves curling into the shape of a serpent. A hoard of cowrie shells found in a desert tomb far from the sea, likely passed through the hands of their merchants. Even genetic studies of modern coastal populations hint at centuries-old mixing between distant island peoples and mainland communities, suggesting a legacy of maritime connection that long outlived the kingdom itself. Perhaps the most compelling clue is a set of underwater inscriptions recently photographed near the suspected ruins. The script is unlike any known on the mainland, but bears resemblance to markings found in port settlements far to the east. If confirmed, it could mean that this kingdom's trade network stretched far beyond what historians have dared to imagine, possibly linking it to civilizations separated by thousands of miles of open water. In our documentary's cinematic arc, this section swells with imagery, ancient ships rocking gently in the harbor as dockworkers load baskets of grain, exotic parrots squawking in cages destined for inland nobles, a market alive with shouting traders and the scent of distant spices. Then the scene shifts abruptly to the silent seabed, where broken amphorae lie scattered, their contents long dissolved into the currents. Trade was the kingdom's lifeblood, and the tsunami was the blade that severed it. In the next section, we will explore how this sudden collapse not only ended an era of prosperity, but also created a power vacuum, one that inland rivals were all too ready to exploit. The tsunami that swallowed the coastal kingdom did more than erase a city. It reshaped the political map. In an instant, a vital hub of commerce, culture, and influence was gone, and the ripples of its absence spread inland faster than the waves themselves. Official history speaks of the disaster only in passing, treating it as an unfortunate but natural event, as though the world simply moved on. But when we dig deeper, a different story emerges, one of opportunism, silent maneuvering, and the calculated rewriting of history. For inland powers, the loss of the kingdom was not just a tragedy, it was an opening. Rival city-states that had once depended on the coastal trade suddenly found themselves free from maritime dependence. Ambitious rulers saw a chance to redirect the flow of goods through their own territories, to control what had once been beyond their grasp. Those who once paid tribute to the sea now turned their gaze to controlling the rivers, caravan routes, and overland markets that could replace the lost trade. In the days following the disaster, survivors staggered inland, bringing with them tales of destruction too vast to comprehend. Many sought refuge in neighboring territories, only to be met with a strange mixture of sympathy and calculation. Some were welcomed, but under conditions pledge loyalty to a new ruler, serve in their armies, surrender their trade secrets. Others were absorbed into the labor force, their skills quietly exploited to strengthen the inland economy. Known history records this period as a time of regional consolidation, a polite term for conquest. Small vulnerable states vanished from the record, absorbed by larger neighbors whose leaders boasted of restoring order in the wake of the disaster. What the official chronicles omit is that these consolidations were not acts of charity, they were deliberate moves to eliminate competition before the coastal survivors could rebuild. Hidden truths surface when we examine the archaeological evidence. In sites dating to just decades after the tsunami, we find inland markets filled with goods that had once been exclusive to the coastal kingdom, carved shell ornaments, gold inlays with distinctive wave motifs, pottery and styles, foreign to the hinterlands. It is as though the inland powers stepped directly into the drowned kingdom's shoes, appropriating not just its trade, but its cultural symbols to legitimize their new status. Some inland leaders even adopted naval imagery in their court art, despite having no fleets of their own. One palace mural shows a ruler standing on the prow of a ship, his cloak billowing, the waves beneath him painted in the same style as those found on coastal ceramics. This was propaganda at work, a way of claiming the prestige of the sea without ever setting foot on its waters. The political maneuvering was not without resistance. There are hints in oral traditions and fragmentary inscriptions of coastal survivors attempting to reclaim their influence. Some banded together to form new settlements along the shore, clinging to the fragments of their maritime heritage. Others took to the sea once more, becoming itinerant traders or even pirates, disrupting the very trade routes the inland powers sought to control. In these shadowy figures we see the last defiant heirs of the drowned kingdom, their ships the final embers of a once great network. Yet inland dominance grew. By monopolizing overland trade and absorbing coastal refugees into their economies, the inland states transformed themselves into regional superpowers. They rewrote the maps, the trade laws, even the histories, ensuring that future generations would know the coast only as a dangerous, unstable frontier. The very memory of the kingdom's political clout was excised, replaced by a narrative that painted them as simple fisherfolk swept away by fate. The cinematic imagery here is stark, a council chamber lit by flickering torches, where inland rulers hunch over maps of new trade routes, a caravan setting out under a cloud of dust, carrying goods once unloaded from ships, a refugee child clutching a carved shell ornament as soldiers in unfamiliar armor patrol the marketplace. Each frame tells the same story, not of natural disaster alone, but of calculated political ascent. And then there are the whispered rumors that some inland rulers may have had foreknowledge of the tsunami. While it is unlikely they understood the exact nature of the coming disaster, ancient prophecies or seismic signs might have suggested danger. If so, withholding that knowledge would have been a ruthless but effective strategy. Allow the sea to destroy a rival, then step in to claim the spoils. Without written proof, such claims remain in the realm of speculation, but they persist in local legends like a splinter that history cannot dislodge. The hidden truth is that the aftermath of the tsunami was not merely a period of recovery, it was a calculated reordering of power. Those who survived on the coast lost their place in the political hierarchy, while those inland rose higher than ever before. The official history tells us the wave was nature's doing. The unwritten history reveals how human ambition can ride the tide of disaster. In the next section, we will follow these inland powers into the heart of their new prosperity, examining how they reshaped their cultures and economies, and how the ghost of the drowned kingdom still haunted their rise. For though the waves had swallowed the city, they had not erased its influence. When the coastal kingdom vanished beneath the waves, the inland powers inherited more than its trade, they inherited its silence. And in that silence, they built a golden age. The chronicles of the inland courts glow with accounts of unprecedented prosperity, bustling markets, artisans producing wonders in gold, ivory, and precious stones. But behind the gleam lies a darker foundation. This prosperity was nourished by the bones of the drowned kingdom, its people, its traditions, and its stolen wealth. In official records, the inland capitals are portrayed as the natural heirs to progress. We rose because the gods favored our diligence, one inscription proclaims, carved deep into a palace wall. We tamed the rivers and brought the mountains to yield. It is a story of self-made glory, a triumph narrative told to legitimize their dominance. The hidden truth, however, is that their sudden wealth did not come from divine blessings or agricultural innovation. It came from seizing the vacuum left by the coastal collapse. The trade routes once channeled through the great harbor now threaded inland like veins feeding a new heart. Caravans arrived loaded with goods the inlanders had never produced themselves, dyed textiles from across the sea, exotic spices that once scented the coastal markets, pearls and coral from distant reefs. Merchants who had lost their coastal warehouses simply relocated their operations under new inland patrons, paying heavier taxes but gaining the protection of fortified cities far from the sea's reach. The inland rulers were quick to capitalize. They expanded market districts, fortified their borders, and commissioned monumental architecture to display their newfound power. The scale of these projects suggests a flood of resources unprecedented in earlier centuries. Stone blocks dragged from quarries now bore carved motifs of ocean waves, an ironic homage to the kingdom they had replaced. We can still see traces of this appropriation in the art of the period. Pottery styles once unique to the coast suddenly appear hundreds of miles inland, copied so faithfully that archaeologists once mistook them for imported goods. Jewelry workshops in the inland cities produced shell-inlaid ornaments identical to those worn by coastal elites, even though the shells themselves had to be brought from distant shores. This was not mere admiration, it was deliberate cultural absorption, the inland powers dressing themselves in the prestige of the vanished kingdom to legitimize their supremacy. There is a chilling practicality to their methods. Coastal survivors, especially artisans and navigators, were resettled under controlled conditions. In some accounts, they were honored as skilled guests, in others they were essentially indentured, their craft knowledge extracted to fuel inland prosperity. Oral histories preserved by their descendants tell of working in inland palaces where the rulers demanded the work of the sea, without the sight of it. It is in these quiet, almost invisible acts of survival that the legacy of the coast continued. Though stripped of its autonomy, the inland golden age was not without its tensions. While trade flourished, the memory of the coast lingered in the stories of those who had fled the waves. Among merchants, sailors, and the children of refugees, whispers persisted that the inland powers had not merely taken advantage of the disaster, but had helped to erase the coastal kingdom's memory on purpose. We see hints of this in the way inland chronicles frame the event. The tsunami is described not as a tragedy for the entire region, but as divine justice upon a decadent and ungrateful people. This moral reframing allowed inland rulers to present their rise as the natural and rightful order of the world. Yet the deeper we look, the more cracks appear in the golden facade. In layers of ash beneath some inland market sites, archaeologists find evidence of riots and sudden abandonments, likely clashes between locals and displaced coastal traders. In one remarkable site, a smashed ceremonial vessel bears both inland and coastal motifs, suggesting a symbolic act of rejection. These moments hint that not everyone accepted the inland narrative of rightful inheritance. Still, the inland capitals reached heights never before seen in the region. They became centers of learning, military organization, and religious innovation. Temples rose with towers designed to touch the clouds, while their walls bore carvings of ships sailing on calm waters, an image the inland population had rarely, if ever, seen in reality. The irony was profound. They built an identity on a maritime culture they no longer possessed, like wearing the skin of a vanished beast. The cinematic contrast is powerful here. Bustling inland markets filled with goods from distant shores, while outside the city walls, former coastal traders tell stories of their lost homeland by firelight. Palace courtyards echo with the sound of hammers crafting sea-inspired jewelry for rulers who have never smelled salt air, a lavish inland banquet featuring seafood, carried for weeks overland, served on plates copied from coastal designs. In this golden age, memory was currency, and the inland rulers were its primary bankers. They decided which parts of the coastal past to preserve, and which to erase. Maritime festivals once tied to the rhythms of the tides were transformed into inland celebrations honoring the rivers. Stripped of their original meanings, coastal gods were reinterpreted as minor deities within inland pantheons, their stories rewritten to place them in service to the inland high gods. The inland prosperity, so celebrated in official histories, was therefore a hybrid, half homegrown, half borrowed from the drowned kingdom. It was a brilliance forged in part from another's ruin, a light that shone brightest because it stood over a shadow, and like all such lights, it carried the risk of eventual dimming when its borrowed fuel ran out. In the next section, we will follow the undercurrents of resistance that began to stir within this inland dominance, efforts by coastal survivors and their descendants to reclaim their heritage, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. For while the inland powers had claimed the riches of the sea, they could never fully contain the restless spirit of those who had once ruled upon it. Beneath the glittering prosperity of the inland capitals, something stirred. It moved quietly, carried not in banners or armies, but in songs, trinkets, whispered stories, and the watchful eyes of those who remembered the sea. The inland rulers may have taken the coastal kingdom's wealth, but they could not entirely erase its spirit. It lived on in the markets, in the caravans, and in the hands of artisans whose work carried memories their masters could not recognize. The inland marketplaces were the perfect cover for resistance. Crowded, noisy, and teeming with goods from faraway lands, they offered anonymity to those who needed it. Amid the stalls selling inland pottery and mountain textiles, there were always a few items that bore subtle marks of the coast, shell inlays carved in patterns that told old maritime legends, knots in fishing nets, tied in ways known only to coastal boat builders, and woven mats dyed in the deep indigo that once marked the sails of royal coastal fleets. To the inland buyer, they were simply pretty objects. To the coastal born, they were messages. These ghosts in the marketplace were more than symbols, they were acts of preservation. Each item carried a fragment of the drowned kingdom, passed hand to hand, never fully explained to outsiders. A carved bone comb might contain tiny etchings of sea creatures from myths forbidden by inland priests. A silver pendant might carry the spiraling wave motif of a coastal storm god, unacknowledged in official temples. The inland elite wore these trinkets without realizing they were wearing defiance. This resistance was not organized in the way we might imagine, no central leader, no grand council. Instead, it was a scattered network of memory keepers, traders, storytellers, artisans, and midwives. Midwives in particular became crucial to this underground movement. In the intimacy of childbirth, they would whisper old songs into the ears of newborns, passing on fragments of language and lore. Some of those children would grow up never knowing the meaning of the songs they hummed, only that they felt inexplicably familiar when they heard the sea. Traveling entertainers also played their part. Wandering musicians, actors, and storytellers moved between inland cities under the guise of performing for festivals. In their plays, they would subtly alter inland tales to insert coastal symbols. A hero might carry a seashell charm for luck, or a victory feast might include a dish once reserved for coastal coronations. The inland audiences enjoyed the novelty without realizing they were hearing the faint heartbeat of a culture they thought was gone. The inland rulers, for their part, were not entirely ignorant of this undercurrent. Palace scribes occasionally record unapproved songs being sung in the markets, or foreign rites performed in rural shrines. Punishments were sometimes harsh, banishments, confiscations, or destruction of suspect goods. But the inland powers faced a dilemma. The goods and skills brought by the coastal survivors were too valuable to eliminate entirely, so they allowed just enough of the old culture to survive to keep trade flowing, while trying to strip it of its meaning. And yet, meaning is stubborn. It clings to objects, to gestures, to rhythms. The more inland officials tried to neutralize coastal traditions, the more those traditions adapted, hiding in plain sight. A harvest festival might be inland in theme, but the music played at its dances still followed the 12-beat patterns of the old maritime rowing songs. A prayer to the inland god of rivers might still be accompanied by the offering of salt water in a shell. We see this duality vividly in one archaeological site, a merchant's house in an inland city destroyed by fire. Among the charred remains were ledgers written in inland script, recording trade in spices and textiles. But beneath the floorboards was a hidden cache, a carved wooden model of a ship with tiny ivory figures of rowers and a captain, all wearing the headdresses of the drowned kingdom. The ship's sails were painted with wave patterns no inland artist would have thought to include. For the descendants of the coastal refugees, resistance was not about restoring their kingdom in the political sense. Such a thing was impossible. The tsunami had not only destroyed their homeland, it had shifted the economic and military balance forever. Instead, resistance meant refusing to let their identity dissolve. It meant ensuring that somewhere, a child could grow up and still taste the salt of their ancestors in the stories they heard. The inland authorities could never fully extinguish this persistence, because it was not overt rebellion, it was memory disguised as commerce, as art, as everyday habit. A potter might claim a spiral design was just decoration, but an elder would know it was the whirlpool that had once marked the entrance to the coastal royal harbor. A fisherman trading river catch for inland grain might casually teach a boy a knot for fun, without explaining it was the same knot that secured the sails of the lost fleets. Even inland citizens of non-coastal heritage began to adopt some of these practices, without understanding their origins. Cultural memory seeped sideways, embedding itself in the larger fabric of inland society. The rulers, in their attempts to suppress the coastal identity, had accidentally made parts of it fashionable. The very objects that were supposed to be stripped of their power became coveted as markers of sophistication. The irony is hard to miss. In trying to wear the skin of the drowned kingdom, the inland powers kept its ghost alive, and that ghost was patient. It did not need to conquer, it only needed to survive in whispers and gestures, until a time when the tides, literal or metaphorical, might turn again. In the next section, we will watch as those whispers begin to grow louder, sparked by natural omens and political missteps that make some inland subjects question the legitimacy of their rulers. The ghosts in the marketplace will no longer be content with hiding, they will begin to speak in ways the inland elite cannot ignore. For decades, the coastal kingdom had existed only in fragments, shells in marketplaces, songs sung in secret, carvings tucked away in the dark. But symbols have a strange power. When repeated enough, they stop being mere echoes, they start to speak. And in the inland cities, where the inland elite believed they had successfully tamed the coastal spirit, the tide was beginning to shift. It began with a single festival. The inland capital was hosting its annual river blessing, a grand event meant to honor the god of inland waters, the lifeblood of agriculture and trade. Traditionally, the festival featured processions of decorated barges, each adorned with symbols of fertility, stalks of grain, clay jars, and woven garlands. But this year, one barge appeared draped in deep indigo cloth patterned with silver spirals. To the inland priests, it was a creative flourish. To those of coastal blood, it was unmistakable, the royal wave motif of the drowned kingdom, displayed openly for the first time in living memory. The crowd noticed. At first, the reaction was confusion. Inland citizens marveled at the beauty of the design, whispering about its unusual craftsmanship. but coastal descendants felt something far deeper, a jolt of recognition, an unspoken affirmation that their heritage had not been erased. Some wept quietly in the crowd. Others hummed fragments of old songs beneath their breath, too softly for the inland guards to hear. Word spread quickly. By the next year, more barges featured subtle coastal elements, shell ornaments, stylized seabirds, carved prows shaped like the ships of ancient seafarers. The inland authorities dismissed it as regional flair, believing they could absorb and dilute the meaning. But the opposite happened. The inland festival was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being rewritten by the very culture it once tried to destroy. And then came the play. A troupe of traveling actors, long known for harmless comedies, premiered a new performance called The Storm That Brought the Harvest. On the surface, it was a tale about a fisherman who braves a river storm to save his village. But to those who knew, the details were striking. The fisherman wore the crest of the drowned coastal kings. The storm was described in the exact language of the ancient tsunami legends. The rescue was aided by a goddess whose shrine had once stood on the vanished shoreline. The inland censors watched the play and found nothing overtly seditious, yet among the audience, whispers spread. This was not a fisherman's tale at all. It was the story of their kingdom's death and survival, disguised as entertainment. The actors had smuggled the coastal kingdom back into public memory without permission. From that point forward, the whispers began to weave themselves into open conversation. Market vendors started greeting each other with the old coastal phrase for fair winds, even when selling inland produce. Musicians added maritime rhythms into inland harvest songs. Craftsmen began producing goods that deliberately blended inland and coastal styles, their seams impossible to untangle. The inland rulers were not blind to this change. Reports from officials warned that old allegiances were resurfacing, especially in towns along the trade roads where coastal descendants lived in large numbers. There were calls to suppress the symbols again, to ban certain patterns, and confiscate suspect goods. But such measures risked alienating merchants and artisans, whose work fueled the inland economy. Cutting off the coastal thread entirely would unravel too much. The turning point came with an unexpected disaster, a severe drought that struck the inland plains. Crops withered, rivers receded, and the inland god of waters seemed to turn his back on the land. Desperate for solutions, some priests quietly invited coastal ritual specialists to perform rain ceremonies, a practice that had been outlawed generations earlier. When rain did come weeks later, the story spread. It was not the inland gods who had saved the harvest, but the old coastal rites. For the first time, inland citizens with no coastal ancestry began to openly adopt the symbols, not as rebellion, but as hope. Indigo sails became lucky charms. Wave patterns were painted on granaries to invite abundance. Inland and coastal customs began to blend in a way that made them inseparable. The inland rulers could not punish this without appearing to condemn the very rituals that had ended the drought. In the streets, the change was palpable. Children played games that involved sailing imaginary ships down the main roads. Young couples exchanged carved shell tokens as love gifts. Elderly storytellers no longer lowered their voices when speaking of the coast. They spoke loudly, drawing crowds. Yet beneath the joy of cultural revival, there was also tension. The inland elite feared what might happen if coastal pride grew too strong. The memory of the drowned kingdom was no longer just a ghost. It was becoming a living thing, one that could inspire questions about rightful rule and historical justice. And indeed, those questions were already forming. In taverns and marketplaces, people began to ask if the coastal kingdom had survived in spirit. Did that mean it might someday return in form? If its people had preserved their traditions for generations, might they also be capable of reclaiming political power? The inland authorities had long relied on the belief that the coastal kingdom was gone forever. Now that belief was cracking. the revival was not without its dangers. Inland hardliners began to accuse coastal descendants of plotting rebellion. They warned of divided loyalties and foreign influence, forgetting, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, that the coast had once been the source of their own wealth and prestige. In this volatile atmosphere, every symbol became charged. A shell necklace could be dismissed as a pretty bauble, or it could be taken as a statement of defiance. A festival barge could be praised for its artistry, or condemned as an act of political sedition. The inland cities were entering a new phase, not one of open conflict yet, but of visible fault lines. What had been whispers in the marketplace had now become a chorus in the public square. And as history has shown, once a chorus begins, it is only a matter of time before it becomes a rallying cry. It began as a clear, warm morning in the inland capital, a day set aside for the royal court's annual parade. Traditionally, this was a celebration of inland power, banners of gold and green fluttering in the breeze, drums beating in a slow, confident rhythm, and the monarch seated atop a towering chariot, drawn by the finest horses in the realm. But this year, the celebration would not belong entirely to the inland crown. In the weeks leading up to the parade, coastal merchants had been unusually active in the markets. They purchased bolts of indigo cloth, carved shell ornaments, and barrels of rare sea salt. The inland authorities assumed these were simply for trade displays during the festival. But the merchants had something else in mind, a silent, unified act of cultural reclamation. When the parade began, the streets were lined with spectators wearing the usual inland festival garb, tunics in earthy tones, wide-brimmed straw hats, necklaces of dried seeds. But here and there, bright spots of deep blue appeared in the crowd. At first, they were isolated, an indigo scarf here, a patterned sash there. By the time the parade reached the marketplace, it was impossible to miss. Hundreds of spectators had adorned themselves with the wave spiral of the drowned kingdom. Some had painted the symbol on their faces, others wore it embroidered on their sleeves. The inland guard stiffened. They were under orders to keep the peace, but the sheer number of symbols made the idea of confiscation absurd. Arresting one or two people would only have inflamed the situation, and so the guards did nothing, at least at first. Then the first float of coastal merchants appeared. Instead of the inland gold and green banners, it was draped entirely in indigo. Its prow was shaped like the ancient seafaring ships of the Lost Kingdom, complete with carved bird figureheads. A dozen musicians stood aboard, playing a rhythm unlike anything heard in inland parades before, a driving, hypnotic beat meant to mimic the crash of waves. The crowd erupted. Coastal descendants cheered openly, some chanting the old royal name. Inland citizens, caught up in the energy, clapped along without fully understanding the subtext. The parade moved on, but the air had shifted. The inland monarch's chariot would soon pass, and the display of unity from the coast was impossible to ignore. By the time the chariot arrived at the marketplace, the sea's presence was everywhere. The crowd was a tapestry of inland and coastal colors, a blending of gold, green, and indigo. And then, from somewhere within the mass of people, a voice called out not a cry of protest, but the opening line of an ancient coastal hymn. Another voice joined. Then another. Within moments, hundreds were singing. It was not a battle chant. It was not a demand. It was a song of mourning, one traditionally sung on the anniversary of the tsunami that destroyed the kingdom. Its melody rose and fell like waves, carrying words the inland rulers had tried to erase, verses about the day the sea took the crown, and the promise that the tide would return. The inland monarch froze in their chariot. The song was not directed against them, but its meaning was unmistakable. This was not a mere act of nostalgia. It was a public, collective declaration that the coastal kingdom was still alive in spirit. What happened next would turn the event from a symbolic moment into a political crisis. A young inland guard, barely older than 20, panicked at the sight of the swelling crowd and the unbroken chant. Without orders, he pushed his way forward and tried to rip the indigo sash from an elderly coastal woman standing near the front. She resisted. The crowd saw the struggle. A dozen people rushed forward to defend her. The scuffle was brief, but its impact was immediate. In the chaos, the elderly woman fell to the ground, her sash torn in half. The song stopped mid-verse, replaced by angry shouts. Guards waded in to restore order, but every movement they made seemed to deepen the sense of injustice. The inland monarch, sensing the danger, raised their hand to halt the parade. For the first time in living memory, the royal procession turned back before completing its route. It was a retreat, and everyone knew it. News of the incident spread faster than the drought story ever had. By nightfall, every coastal descended household in the capital had heard about the torn sash. By morning, it was being retold in inland towns as well. The details grew in the telling. Some claimed the woman had been struck, others that the guard had shouted insults about sea ghosts and drowned traders. Whether or not these were true no longer mattered. The narrative had taken hold. Coastal leaders in the city called it the day the sea came to the capital. They argued that it proved their people could no longer be ignored or suppressed without consequence. Inland officials, alarmed by the speed of the cultural wave, urged the monarch to impose strict regulations on public gatherings. But the monarch hesitated. Cracking down too hard could push the coastal movement into open rebellion. Doing nothing might embolden it further. Meanwhile, in the markets and taverns, people began to speak openly about the possibility of a coastal revival, not just as a cultural movement, but as a political force. Merchants discussed forming councils to represent coastal interests. Musicians planned public performances of banned songs. Even inland citizens with no coastal ancestry began wearing the wave spiral as a quiet show of solidarity. The moment had arrived when inland rulers could no longer pretend the coastal kingdom was just a chapter in the history books. The symbols had marched into the heart of inland power, wrapped themselves around its festivals, and left behind a story that could not be unwritten. And as elders among the coastal community warned, once the sea reaches the capital, it never recedes willingly. The royal council chamber had never felt so tense. The inland monarch sat at the far end of a long, polished table, the air heavy with the mingled scents of sandalwood and ink. Outside, the city still hummed with the aftershocks of the parade incident. Merchants speaking in hushed tones, street performers weaving coastal symbols into their acts, and the capital's narrow alleys alive with whispered speculations about the future. The monarch's most senior advisors were divided. On one side sat the hardliners, generals and court officials who believed the coastal movement had crossed a line. They saw the wave spiral banners, the hymn, and the public defiance as a direct challenge to the throne's legitimacy. "If this is allowed to continue," growled one general, his voice carrying across the chamber, "the next parade will not be a song, it will be a march of open rebellion." On the other side sat the pragmatists, merchants, diplomats, and scholars who understood the danger of pushing too hard. They argued that the coastal movement was still, at its core, cultural rather than military. The moment it was met with force, it could transform into something far more dangerous. "We cannot drown the tide with our fists," said the chancellor, an aging inland noble with a reputation for measured wisdom. "We must redirect it, or risk being swept away." The monarch listened, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on a map of the kingdom. The coastline stretched like a jagged scar along the map's left edge, a reminder of both the old kingdom's glory and the tsunami's destruction. For years, the inland crown had treated that coastline as a quiet, conquered frontier. Now it was a boiling sea of political energy with the potential to spill far inland. As the debate raged, messengers arrived with troubling news. In the coastal quarter of the capital, artisans were working overnight to produce more wave spiral banners. Several inland districts reported seeing the symbol carved into doorframes and painted on market stalls. In one fishing town far to the west, an entire marketplace had spontaneously erupted into the same hymn sung during the parade, drawing a crowd large enough to block the harbor for hours. The monarch knew these were not isolated incidents. They were signals, flares in the dark, that the coastal movement was becoming more coordinated. Whether by design or by the natural flow of shared memory, people across the kingdom were aligning themselves with the story of the drowned crown. That night, the monarch walked alone through the palace's oldest wing. Here, carved into the stone walls, were faint depictions of battles long past, scenes from the original war that had brought the inland crown to power over the coast. The victors were shown in heroic poses, while the coastal defenders were rendered as desperate, almost feral figures fighting against an inevitable tide. But in one panel, half erased by centuries of wear, the coastal defenders stood not in retreat but in defiance, their sails raised against the wind. The monarch paused there, tracing the faint outline of a ship's prow with their fingertips. History, they knew, was rarely as one-sided as the carvings claimed, and the more they thought about the drowned kingdom, the more they saw the parallels between then and now. The tsunami had been nature's strike, but the inland conquest had been human. The coastal people had never truly been defeated in spirit, only in arms. The decision before the monarch was a choice between two storms. The first was the storm of suppression to declare the coastal movement unlawful, arrest its leaders, and strip the capital of its coastal symbols. This would show strength, but it risked igniting open rebellion across the coastline. The second was the storm of concession to offer the coastal people representation in the royal council, perhaps even to recognize elements of their heritage officially. This, however, would be seen by hardliners as weakness, a sign that the inland crown could be pressured into bending. By dawn, the monarch had made their decision. A royal decree was drafted, but it was unlike anything the kingdom had seen in generations. It announced the formation of a unified waters council, a governing body that would include representatives from both inland and coastal communities. Its purpose officially was to manage trade, fisheries, and cultural preservation along the coast. Unofficially, it was a calculated attempt to draw the coastal leadership into the machinery of inland governance, giving them a voice, but also binding them to the kingdom's framework. The announcement stunned the court. Hardliners were furious, warning that it would embolden the coastal cause rather than contain it. Pragmatists argued it was a master stroke, transforming a potential insurgency into a negotiated partnership. The coastal population's response was equally divided. Some saw it as a long overdue acknowledgement of their heritage. Others suspected it was a trap, a way for the inland rulers to dilute their movement with political bureaucracy. In the days that followed, preparations for the first council meeting began. Coastal leaders selected delegates, fishermen, merchants, and even a renowned historian, whose family claimed descent from the drowned royal line. The inland court prepared to receive them with the same pomp given to visiting dignitaries. And yet, beneath the surface of ceremony, the capital buzzed with unease. For every inland citizen who welcomed the idea of unity, another saw it as a threat to the kingdom's stability. In the coastal towns, celebrations of the council's creation were tempered by quiet warnings from elders. The tide does not always bring what it promises. But for the first time in living memory, the symbols of the drowned kingdom and the inland crown would sit at the same table. The sea had not yet claimed the throne, but the water was lapping at its foundations. The morning of the council's first assembly dawned under a pale silver sky. A thin mist clung to the capital's stone streets, muffling the sound of carts and footsteps. It was as though the city itself were holding its breath, waiting to see whether this unprecedented gathering would unite the kingdom or drive its fracture line deeper. The royal palace had been transformed for the occasion. Coastal banners, wave spirals, ship silhouettes, and blue-green pennants fluttered alongside the inland crown's gold and crimson standards. The decision to display them together was controversial, but the monarch had insisted. Let the people see both tides, they had said. We will either sail together or sink together. The coastal delegation arrived mid-morning, their procession drawing crowds that spilled into the streets. Fishermen in clean white tunics walked alongside traders in embroidered jackets, their faces solemn but proud. At the head of the group walked the historian, an older man with a lined face and eyes as sharp as polished obsidian. His name was Seren Tel Ris, and though he wore no crown, his presence commanded the kind of reverence usually reserved for kings. Under his arm he carried a weathered scroll tube sealed with blue wax, the rumored last surviving decree of the drowned kingdom's final ruler. Inside the grand hall, the tension was almost physical. The inland delegates sat stiff-backed in carved oak chairs, their expressions ranging from wary curiosity to open hostility. The monarch presided from a raised dais, their robes a careful blend of inland authority and coastal symbolism. Between the two factions stood the newly built council table, circular by design, with no head, no foot, no implied hierarchy. The first hours were cautious. They spoke of fisheries, harbor maintenance, and trade tariffs, practical matters that allowed both sides to find common ground. Inland merchants saw opportunity in expanding seaborne trade routes. Coastal representatives pressed for the restoration of storm-damaged harbors. Applause was sparse, but genuine. But when the discussion turned to cultural preservation, the air shifted. Seren Tel Ris rose, unsealing the blue wax tube with deliberate slowness. From it he withdrew a brittle sheet of vellum, its edges water-stained and frayed. In the stillness of the hall, he read aloud, not in the inland tongue, but in the flowing syllables of the old coastal language. Few in the room understood the words, but the cadence was undeniable, measured, regal, mournful. When he finished, he translated, "Let the sea take what it must, but may it never take our name. As long as one voice speaks for us, the kingdom lives." It was, he explained, the final proclamation of the last coastal monarch before the tsunami swallowed their capital. The historian's voice did not tremble, but his gaze swept the inland delegates like a tide testing a seawall. "We have spoken for centuries in whispers," he said. "Now we speak here, where all can hear." The hall erupted in debate. Inland hardliners bristled, some called it a veiled claim to sovereignty. Coastal delegates argued it was simply a plea for recognition. The monarch raised a hand, and the noise ebbed. "We are not here to reopen the old war," they said. "We are here to decide if the kingdom's future will be shared, or if the sea will claim it twice." What followed was less negotiation than weathering a storm. Accusations broke like waves, concessions emerged like fleeting patches of sunlight, and every agreement was balanced on the knife edge of mistrust. Yet slowly, a framework began to take shape. Coastal heritage would be officially recognized in the kingdom's records, with protections for its language, festivals, and symbols. Inland and coastal districts would share equal voting weight in council decisions affecting trade and maritime law. An annual Remembrance Day for the tsunami's victims would be established, with ceremonies held both inland and on the coast. These points were small victories, fragile and incomplete, but they were victories nonetheless. When the assembly adjourned, the monarch stood from the dais and stepped down to the council floor. In a gesture that stunned the room, they extended their hand to Seren Tel Ris. The historian hesitated only a moment before clasping it. The moment was brief, but the image, two leaders, one from the land and one from the sea, would be etched into memory and retold for generations. Outside, the capital's streets were already alive with rumor. Some whispered that the inland crown had been forced to kneel. Others believed the coastal cause had been tamed. Most simply watched the banner, gold and crimson beside blue and green, flutter together in the soft wind, and wondered if this was the dawn of something new or just the eye of a larger storm. That night, as the city settled into uneasy quiet, the monarch stood at the palace balcony, looking toward the distant, unseen coast. The waves would be crashing there as they always had, as they always would. The council's agreements were written in ink and parchment, but the sea cared nothing for such things. One day it might come again without warning, to sweep away the careful balance they had built. For now, though, there was peace. Not the unshakable peace of still waters, but the fragile peace of a ship riding a changing tide. And somewhere in the mist between land and sea, the drowned kingdom stirred, not as a ghost of the past, but as a living voice in the kingdom's future. The morning of the council's first assembly dawned under a pale silver sky. A thin mist clung to the capital's stone streets, muffling the sound of carts and footsteps. It was as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether this unprecedented gathering would unite the kingdom, drive its fracture line deeper. The royal palace had been transformed for the occasion. Coastal banners, wave spirals, ship silhouettes, and blue-green pennants fluttered alongside the inland crown's gold and crimson standards. The decision to display them together was controversial, but the monarch had insisted. Let the people see both tides, they had said. We will either sail together or sink together. The coastal delegation arrived mid-morning, their procession drawing crowds that spilled into the streets. Fishermen in clean white tunics walked alongside traders in embroidered jackets, their faces solemn but proud. At the head of the group walked the historian, an older man with a lined face and eyes as sharp as polished obsidian. His name was Tsunamis, and though he wore no crown, his presence commanded the kind of reverence usually reserved for kings. He carried under his arm a weathered scroll tube sealed with blue wax, the rumored last surviving decree of the drowned kingdom's final ruler. Inside the grand hall, the tension was almost physical. The inland delegates sat stiff, backed in carved oak chairs, their expressions ranging from wary curiosity to open hostility. The monarch presided from a raised dais, their robes a careful blend of inland authority and coastal symbolism. Between the two factions stood the newly built council table, circular by design, no head, no foot, no implied hierarchy. The first hours were cautious. They spoke of fisheries, harbor maintenance, and trade, tariffs, practical matters that allowed both sides to find common ground. Inland merchants saw opportunity in expanding seaborne trade routes. Coastal representatives pushed for restoration of storm-damaged harbors. Applause was sparse but genuine. But when the discussion turned to cultural preservation, the air shifted. Tsunamis rose, unsealing the blue wax tube with deliberate slowness. From it he withdrew a brittle sheet of vellum, its edges water-stained and frayed. In the stillness of the hall he read aloud, not in the inland tongue but in the flowing syllables of the old coastal language. Few in the room understood the words, but the cadence was undeniable, measured, regal, mournful. When he finished he translated, "Let the sea take what it must, but may it never take our name. As long as one voice speaks for us, the kingdom lives." It was, he explained, the final proclamation of the last coastal monarch before the tsunami swallowed their capital. The historian's voice did not tremble, but his gaze swept the inland delegates like a tide testing a seawall. "We have spoken for centuries in whispers," he said. "Now we speak here where all can hear." The hall erupted in debate. Inland hardliners bristled, some called it a veiled claim to sovereignty. Coastal delegates argued it was simply a plea for recognition. The monarch raised a hand and the noise ebbed. "We are not here to reopen the old war," they said. "We are here to decide if the kingdom's future will be shared or if the sea will claim it." Twice what followed was less negotiation than weathering a storm. Accusations broke like waves, concessions emerged like fleeting patches of sunlight, and every agreement was balanced on the knife edge of mistrust. Yet slowly a framework began to take shape. Coastal heritage would be officially recognized in the kingdom's records, with protection for its language, festivals, and symbols. Inland and coastal districts would share equal voting weight in council decisions affecting trade and maritime law. An annual Remembrance Day for the tsunami's victims would be established with ceremonies held both inland and on the coast. These points were small victories, fragile and incomplete, but they were victories nonetheless. When the assembly adjourned, the monarch stood from the dais and stepped down to the council floor. In a gesture that stunned the room, they extended their hand to Saren Telris. Historian hesitated only a moment before clasping it. The moment was brief, but the image, two leaders, one from the land and one from the sea, would be etched into memory and retold for generations. Outside the capital's streets were already alive with rumor. Some whispered that the inland crown had been forced to kneel. Others believed the coastal cause had been tamed. Most simply watched the banners gold and crimson beside blue and green flutter together in the soft wind and wondered if this was the dawn of something new or just the eye of a larger storm. That night, as the city settled into uneasy quiet, the monarch stood at the palace balcony, looking toward the distant unseen coast. The waves would be crashing there as they always had, as they always would. The council's agreements were written in ink and parchment, but the sea cared nothing for such things. One day it might come again without warning to sweep away the careful balance they had built. For now, though there was peace, not the unshakable peace of still waters, but the fragile peace of a ship riding a changing tide. And somewhere in the mist between land and sea, the drowned kingdom stirred, not as a ghost of the past but as a living voice in the kingdom's future. Giskind, Kims of Kaken's future, Giskind, poured and wissen the Diskin cell. Sits of Kaken wissen Diskin cell.